Welcome back. So this year saw the National Student Financial Aid Scheme facing serious challenges that led to the board being put under administration. At the start of the academic year, students faced multiple issues owing to the scheme's payment systems. Recently, the scheme announced that over 500,000 applications for financial aid for the coming academic year have been provisionally approved. But for some reflection on the year that was for NSFAS, I am now joined by Mr. Freeman Nomvalo, who is, of course, the scheme's administrator, and Asive Dlanjwa, who is, of course, the spokesperson for the South African Union of Students. Gentlemen, a good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. There's a lot to talk about, but I think, Mr. Nomvalo, I'll let you have the first bite here and talk about, as you wrap up the year as NSFAS, I imagine that you have had a period of consolidation. You can say, well, these are our top 3 or 4 successes in this particular year, and perhaps some issues that you think really are going to be where you can improve in 2025. Talk to us about that view from consolidation.
Thank you, Naledi. Good evening to yourself and your viewers, and good evening to Asive. As you will recall and probably know from the terms of reference, that there were a number of issues that NSFAS was facing at the time when it was put on administration. One of them was the issue that relate to student allowances. Mainly TVET colleges were worst affected by that. The issues of the annual financial statements that had not been produced for a number of years, which makes it difficult to raise funds to cover some of the students that are not able to be covered by government. And thirdly, the issue of the closeout process, which unfortunately affects students negatively, in that, to the extent that we haven't reconciled between ourselves and the institutions, some students' lives are in limbo as a result of that. The issues of appeals. So I'm going to start with the issues of allowances. We've stabilized that side of things quite successfully. Of course, we would want to extend the issue of direct payments of allowances to universities, but the issue of the court case that we are facing has stalled that process to be completed completely. But we have stabilized that issue for the TVET colleges successfully at the moment. Secondly, we have submitted the annual financial statements up until the end of the financial year 2024, which is for the March 2024 financial statements. We are now currently preparing the 2024-25 financial statements, which we believe will be tabled in time this year. So that part of things is now up to date. On the closeout, we have received all of the information from all of the TVET colleges up until 2022. There's still some TVET colleges with some missing information for 2023. But all universities, we have received the information, and we are now in a position to finalize the reconciliations and close the closeout process, and make sure that those students who are still in limbo because they were probably funded, but information between us and the institutions was not properly reconciled, and therefore have not been, we have not dispersed for them, and therefore they can't get their results. We should be able to close all of that soon in the coming year, having updated all of the information with institutions. The 2 pieces that I think we still need huge improvement is the issues of dealing with appeals. That has been a painful exercise. Yes, we've dealt with majority of appeals substantially. We had about 80,000 appeals when I joined, and they've reduced to a few thousand that we're still processing at the moment. We need to make sure that that process works well and works smoothly. And we have taken advice of a number of stakeholders, including the student movement, in terms of how we should deal with that going forward. As well as the issues of student accommodation. While we've made a lot of progress in ensuring that long outstanding amounts are paid, we still see a risk in that there is a few landlords that still come forward and say, I have this and that item outstanding, and therefore those landlords may create problems for us in January. But we have put in place a plan so that we are able to respond to those quickly. And there is a team that is working as I'm speaking to you to make sure that those payments are made Friday next week, as well as early January, to the extent that there will be anything outstanding. So a lot of progress has been made to stabilize the sector, but there are still issues that need to be attended to. And unfortunately, these issues affect the lives of students negatively, as I've just said.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, there's obviously a lot to talk about, and so that's why I'm really starting quite broad, and then we'll zone in on some of the issues that I think are really going to be niggling as we get into the festive season. But a critical stakeholder here, of course, being the students themselves, the body that represents them, and the rating that they give to the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, incredibly important as we consolidate the year. Asive, from the position of the South African Union of Students, improvements and some concerning areas in 2024 for NSFAS. I'm almost tempted to say, you know, give us a rating out of 10 on how NSFAS has operated this year to serve students, where 0 is really bad and 10 being absolutely excellent. Perhaps you can start there.
Good evening, Naledi, your viewers and your listeners, and also to Mr. Freeman Nomvalo. Look, I will end off with the rating, but maybe let me qualify that what will be that rating ultimately. So I think the first thing is that we have been very critical of the scheme, especially as it pertains to its ability to respond to the challenges of the poor and the working class, particularly in terms of ensuring that we broaden access, because what has been our obsession and preoccupation is the extent to which we can broaden access to institutions of higher learning for the poor and for the working class. And NSFAS is having that responsibility. So we have been very critical, you will know, on this platform, primarily for the last about 2 to 3 years, especially around the academic year of 2023. It was a very difficult academic year for our students, and the first part of this year. So there's been issues there. Some of the most critical issues which we have always bemoaned. The first one was the lack of leadership and capacity at NSFAS. It was an organization that had been unfortunately filled with some of the most useless people ever, all the way from the board, when there was still a board, to when we had an executive. And we're not saying this because we're being petty, but we measured the success of and the extent to which there was capacity of that leadership, to the extent to which students were able to receive primarily their allowances on time, they were able to be registered on time, etc. And for the last 2 years, that has not been happening at all. In fact, for the academic year of 2023, we had about just over 100,000 students that had not received their allowances since May up until the end of the year, which was absolutely bemoanable. So these are some of the challenges we have had. Obviously, we began the year also with some of these challenges. What are some of those challenges? For instance, this year was the inability of the scheme to be able to synchronize its operations with that of universities, particularly, to the extent to which universities would begin their registrations, and when they begin to register, NSFAS would not have concluded their own processes, to the extent to which the students of the poor ended up waiting outside and not having space. And to qualify that, you would remember that you would have a university, for instance, of WITS or UFS, having only 7,000 spaces for first years, with over 300,000 applications, admitting on a first-come, first-served basis. And the students of the poor, because they did not have money at hand and they were waiting for NSFAS, they ended up forfeiting their spaces to those that could afford. So these are hundreds and thousands of students that unfortunately suffered this fate. So that was one of the first challenges. The second challenge was the issue of students not receiving their allowances on time. And one of the things that undermined, unfortunately, the ability of the scheme to provide allowances on time was criminality, was greed, was lack of leadership. which we saw, which led to the dissolution of the board for us to have an administration right now. To the extent to which there were thugs that had been appointed to disperse some of these allowances, and obviously it failed, as we had predicted that it would fail, because of certain things in the systems that we said they just would not work. So that was one of the things that obviously undermined students a lot, to the extent to which they could not be able to, they did not have accommodation, they did not have food, they did not have books, and whatever other necessities they needed to participate adequately in teaching and learning. But one of the other legacy issues of the lack of leadership of this time, for instance, of last year, as I'm saying, is that some students fell off the funding because of administrative issues at NSFAS, and when they began this year, they were in a limbo, in some state of purgatory, and they could not register this year. So these are some of the challenges that we have faced. The administration came on, and we must be critical and yet to be honest at the same time that since the beginning of the administration, there was not a single month whereby we saw students in their thousands not receiving allowances. Students began to receive the allowances on time, and the service providers that were appointed illegally stopped working, and the students were receiving their money directly from the institutions. In TVET, students began to receive their money directly, their bank accounts from NSFAS. So these are some of the critical things that were leading to strikes and protests almost on a monthly basis. And since then, we have not had those challenges. Has there been challenges? Yes. There are challenges of appeals. For instance, we've got thousands of students that their appeals that they've not been responded to. And we're also of the feeling that although some of the appeals have been concluded, that it was not necessary, there was not diligence that was done, because some of them were rejected, but those students, for instance, their parents are still unemployed, but the students have been rejected. So there's still work that needs to be done. So what we would rate NSFAS, to answer your question, I will break it up in terms of two periods. Pre-administration, it was -3 out of 10, and now during the administration, we think we can give them a 6.3 out of 10.
I'm laughing at how you're adding decimals as well. Asive, really interesting. So I don't know what you make of that, Freeman. The institution going from the view of students, a -3 out of 10 to a 6.3 with that very emphatic decimal, as steps in the right direction, obviously. And you hear, Asive even talking about things that have been able to be improved in 2024. But he did raise something at the top there, which I think is incredibly important: the inability to synchronize your operations as NSFAS with those of universities. I mean, talk to me about how we improve that in 2025, an incredibly important task that for a particular student, we can certainly count how many thousands we're talking about, but when we talk about an individual student, it's the difference between what their future looks like and the opportunities that they simply can't access. So how do we plan to get that right next year?
Yes, first I'll start with the issue that before I go to the alignment, one of the important points that Asive is raising, that students go to campuses without the provisional funded status, which enables them to register in time. We have received all of the SAUS. We have received about 890,000 applications this year, new applications, and all of the SAUS applications are automatic approval to go to the next stage. We've got about 260,000 applications, which are non-SAUS applications that require processing. And the team has been processing those at a rate of about just above 20,000 applications a day. And therefore, we're confident that by the 31st of December, all of those applications will have been processed if all of the information is submitted. We do note that there's quite a number of students that still have not submitted some of the documents, and they have been communicated with. I want to use this opportunity to say, all the students must submit the information. On the issue of the alignment of processes, there's two things that we've responded to do. One, we've made sure that our systems are stabilized, at least the information as it comes through, even though it's still uploaded manually, at least that information results in stable statuses of students. Secondly, the issue of organizational realignment at NSFAS, we're looking at ensuring that we've got sufficient capacity in all of the areas. But most importantly, we've got a plan to have deployed in every institution NSFAS people that will be enabling the process of gathering the information at the beginning of the year. We had a workshop earlier today with the team at NSFAS to outline in a lot more detail what do we expect from institutions in terms of registration data and so on. Will there be problems in January? I anticipate that there will be. But I think with the plan that we put in place and the deployments that we'll be making and the level of detail we're getting into in trying to plan, we should be able to respond relatively quickly.
Yeah.
One, we will have the provisionally funded status ready by the end of December.
Yep.
Secondly, the processing further from that point, we believe that we have put processes in place to make sure that it happens as quickly as possible.
Right. There's a little bit more to discuss, and we're going to do that on the other side of this short break. So do continue to be on the line with us. We are, of course, in conversation with Freeman Nomvalo, who is the NSFAS administrator, as well as the spokesperson of the SA Union of Students, Asive Dlanjwa, as we really look at 2024 for NSFAS. How did they do? More on the other side of this short break. Welcome back. You're still watching News at Prime with myself, Naledi Mulo. We continue to review the year that was for the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, and of course looking at some of the improvements that they can make in the year 2025, in conversation with Freeman Nomvalo, the scheme's administrator, as well as Asive Dlanjwa, spokesperson for the SA Union of Students. In fact, Asive, briefly, if you'd allow me to bring this in, there's certainly been the issue around just how many sort of payouts students actually get per year from NSFAS, and then concerns about, what that looks like for students then in this particular month. When we talk about the most vulnerable learners, there has been, of course, the issue that some learners actually using some of these funds also to support vulnerable families. I mean, is that an issue that is on your radar?
Absolutely, Naledi. In fact, when NSFAS had been failing to pay allowances in end of the year last year, we actually had scores of students that could not travel back home because they relied on those allowances even to be able to travel back home. And I'm not speaking of exceptions. These were thousands of students that were reliant on that money. So this highlights and indicates and demonstrates to the viewers really the extent to which, over and above the money having to sustain the students such that they're able to adequately participate in teaching and learning, that they regrettably have had to use the same funds to be able to support their families and send some of these monies at home. And this is why, for instance, we've called on institutions that for you to purely be reliant on the fact that the students are having allowances from NSFAS is not enough in terms of us dealing with the food insecurity in institutions. At one point, it was sitting around 78%, by the way, across all institutions, food insecurity. So the point is that we still have a huge crisis. And someone once said, foolishly, we must encourage the students not to assist at home. I say foolishly because for them, the ability to receive NSFAS, to receive education, whatever allowances they have, it is if you like they feel they have a responsibility to whatever they are receiving to be able to support at home and to be able to contribute back at home. So unfortunately, there's nothing that can be done about that, but it really highlights, and this is why we have been calling, for instance, for an increase in those allowances, to say that there needs to be an increase in those allowances. When you look at them over time, they've remained stagnant. I think the first time we had an allowance was for the academic year of 2023, and the last time we had an allowance was back in 2018. So they've remained stagnant relatively over time, and we're saying these need to be increased so that we're able to support the students more holistically.
Yeah. Freeman, is that something that is being talked about within NSFAS as well. You know, the fact that perhaps when these learners are not going to school, that those funds make a difference to vulnerable families as well. I think your mic is off, Freeman.
Hello, sorry.
Yes, there you go. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I was talking to myself. We do engage with that issue because the NSFAS operates within the context of the South African society. And therefore, the levels of poverty that are outside of the ambit of NSFAS do impact NSFAS as students feel sorry for their loved ones at home and thinking that the little they have, they need to spread as far as is possible. The only issue in this particular conversation is that it becomes difficult for NSFAS to engage more meaningfully on this, because NSFAS receives the allocation from the state, and once that allocation is there, NSFAS must make sure that it reaches as many people as possible. Is the efficiency of NSFAS, which Mr. Dlanjwa always raises with us, that with the little that we have, if we are able to execute our function efficiently and quickly, it reduces the impact. But the amounts that must be allocated, the increases that must be allocated, it's a conversation that NSFAS cannot necessarily resolve, but through the department as well as the budget allocation process, that issue ought to be engaged with. Obviously, there's many needs in our society, given the manner in which the economy has been performing in the past few years. It makes it difficult. So NSFAS has to be efficient so that the little that is available does reach those part of society where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and that certainly is, I think, a great place for us to leave it, because it says a clear understanding, perhaps from both parties, on what needs to be improved in 2025. Let's chat at the beginning of the year then to see how things kick off. We really do appreciate your time. Freeman Nomvalo, NSFAS Administrator, speaking to us this evening, as well as Asive Dlanjwa, the spokesperson for the South African Union of Students, rating NSFAS's performance in 2024 as a 6.3 out of 10.